Welcome, Mr. Mason here. This will be his second trip here.
Yeah.
He was a British bomber pilot in World War II, and we have some pictures of the planes when he flew. The last speech was very, very nice and kept me very well entertained, not only during the speech, but when we looked at it later on. And I'm sure tonight will be no different. So without further ado, let me give you your microphone here.
It's a surprise to me, and I say this time after time, that there's so many people still interested in World War II. That was a few years ago. I'm 93, and it's only a number. Mine's unlisted. Of course, World War II is different than like the war today. There weren't any robots then, or electrically controlled missiles, or. But anyway, somehow or other, we get through one way or another. I hope I don't bore you with these World War II stories. I'll tell you a little about myself. I was born in Canada, grew up in Toledo, worked at NASA. My wife has a lot of favorite expressions like, I don't think you'd have ever found your way out of Germany without a navigator. And I get lost in Avon Lake. My whole idea back in the 40s, I wanted to learn to fly. I really wasn't much interested in the war, but airplanes fascinated me. And as it turned out, after I had completed, I was living in Toledo, and I completed 2 years at the University of Toledo, and that was before Pearl Harbor. And the U.S. Air Force were looking for individuals with 2 years of college to teach them to fly and get them involved in the war, although the U.S. wasn't actually committed to it. And I was going to the University of Toledo. One of these traveling and recruiting groups showed up there, and they signed me up. And I got shipped off to a Chinook field. And when I got there, the guy that was looking at my file, he said, I see here you were born in Canada. What proof of citizenship do you have? In those days, that was a requirement. I said, citizenship? What's that? And he said, well, I'm sorry, we're going to ship you back home. So after I got back to Toledo, I was in a bar one night, and I ran into a young fellow that I'd gone to high school with in a Royal Canadian Air Force uniform. So I got talking to him, and he said, if you drive me back to Goddard, he was stationed in Goddard, which is just north of Detroit. He said, I'll buy you your gas, and you can stay with, that's how loose they were. He says, you can stay with me and I'll take you flying. Well, that happened. That was too much. I went down to Windsor and joined up. I was called up in the Canadian Air Force in April of '42, and I was posted to what they call Manning Depot in Toronto, and that was like a boot camp. And I don't think I ever was in any better shape than they put me through to put me in good shape. We used to go out on the beaches there in Toronto and run and do calisthenics, and we had a sergeant that yelled in your face, you know, I had 13 pints of beer last night and I still do my PT. I was posted to a field on the Ottawa River called St. Eugene, and they had what the Canadians called fleet finches, which are the same as the steermen which the U.S. Air Force used to train. Guess you probably had that. Yes. Yeah. And my solo story, I'd had about 6 hours, I think, in a fleet finch. And my instructor said to me, "You're not going to kill me. Go on, go." So I took off, circled around, came down to land, and I came in too steep. And when I hit, it bounced and it got turned around. I'm going across the field this way instead of that way. And here's another plane standing there with an instructor alongside it with a student, and that was my instructor. So I nearly did kill him. Anyway, I went on to advance what the Canadians call SFTs, and in May of 1943 I got my wings and my commission, and a bunch of us went down to Toronto to celebrate, and we got a room in the Royal York, and we were filling condoms with water and dropping them out the window, bombing, precision bombing. People walking along the street. And for some reason the hotel took a dim view of that. And right after that I was posted to England. And back in those days, everything transported from Canada to England across the North Sea. And the convoys were taking such a beating from the German U-boats that they changed that. The air crew, who they'd spent all this money on and trained, had to go across in a liner, you know, like a. Well, we went over in. Anyway, it was a big ocean liner, and they had gutted it and were taking the air crew over in that. And of course, it went. We guessed up to 30-some knots, and that could outrun the U-boats. And we used to, during the day, we used to zigzag every 1,000 yards, and at night it'd just go straight and put the metal to the pedal to the metal, and the whole ship would shake from the diesel engines. But at least we weren't. No one bothered us, and I landed in Liverpool, and we were posted down to Bournemouth, which was down on the south coast of England, and. Back in those days, there was a Lord Haw-Haw, he was called. He was on the radio from Germany. And like he said, I heard him on one Sunday, "We know all you Canadians are down there in Bournemouth, and we know that you'll kill yourselves on the bicycles." Anyway, I was in training over there because the British needed multi-engine pilots, although I had gotten my wings on a single engine. That didn't faze them. I got posted up to Scotland to convert to multi-engine. And that's when I got my crew. And they sent us to this one airfield, and they had there every, like a navigator, bomb aimer, the gunners, what they call the wireless operator, which is a radio operator. And they said, "Go out in the parking lot and find yourself a crew." So I can't say this enough, how lucky I was with the crew I got, because it was strictly, you know, like you want to fly with me? And I didn't even know his name. Anyway, particularly my navigator, who was a Canadian, and he had worked for a construction company in Canada as a draftsman. So you can imagine what his logs looked like. The navigation leader in the squadron used to take his logs and put them up on the bulletin board and say, this is the way we want it. Anyway, I had a lot of confidence in him. I saw him many times after the war. He lived in Burlington, and I used to travel up there to go out to lunch with him or something. But he's passed away now. But anyway, I consider myself very lucky. I've started out on twin engines, Wellington, and did my first ops in February of '44, and then I got into Halifax's, which was a 4-engine, and then finally into Lancasters, like that, and like this. I have to say the Lancaster was a fabulous plane. The other thing the RAF did, they could only afford one pilot. We didn't have co-pilots. But what you did, you tried to train somebody in your crew to at least be able to fly a course. And my engineer, I taught him that. And then my navigator had been a washed out pilot, so he was ideal to teach to shoot landings. So, some way I had 2 members of my crew that could fly. And that was ultimate to survival for some people. The Lancaster was a beautiful plane to fly. You could put it right on its wingtip and whatever you needed to do. And the evasive action that we used to get away from a fighter was a steep turn and full rudder, so you're sliding. And that seemed to work. I can't say how or why, but somehow or other the Jerry's never figured that out. I mean, some of the things that I think about now that you wouldn't normally consider detrimental. I mean, the weather, and the weather over the continent, over Germany, was not ideal. And of course, in England, there was always a haze, and you could hit storms like with icing, and what you do is you try to climb out of it or around it. Sometimes it was so high you couldn't get over it. And of course, naturally with the Jerry's, they're night fighters, and they're flak. You'd get shot up and lose an engine, you'd limp back on 3 engines. But somehow or other we got through it. The problem was, see, we flew in a stream. We didn't fly in formation. But as long as you were bumping along, you were in somebody's stream, and that made you feel pretty confident. You were in the stream somewhere. And at night you didn't see that much, although the gunners were practicing night vision constantly. And we got off course. We were going to Kassel one night, which is south of the Ruhr, down near Frankfurt. And we got blown off course and ended up over Cologne in the Ruhr. And we lost an engine, got a few holes in us. Nobody got hit. And the thing that I'm most grateful for, my rear gunner picked up a fighter coming in on us from 600 yards. And of course, he shot our one port engine, and we lost it. We had to feather it and put the fire out. And here's my rear gunner back there, SN Charlie, pumping his turret because the hydraulic power for his turret came from that engine that we'd lost. So he's pumping it by hand and doing his search. And he picked up this fighter coming in on us and opened fire on him. And of course, his 4 guns and the mid-uppers 2 guns. This poor guy had a lot of flashes coming at him from the flak and from his guns, and he didn't stay around very long. To get you in the mood, I did get shot up over Kiel, which is a big submarine base, and I lost my rear gunner, so I had to get another gunner for him, take his place. He was a nice 19-year-old kid. I had to go and talk to his parents. That was sad. But the gunner that I got to replace him, oddly enough, he was a Welshman, and we called him Taffy. And he used to, and he's the one that saved our necks by hand and working that turret. He was with a crew before he got to us, and coming back over England, they got shot down, and they were forced to go into a woods, and he was the only one of the crew that survived. And he was in the hospital for a while, and then when he got out, they gave him to us. I guess I said it, but I can't say it enough. I was really proud of my crew. When we were in the main force to start with, and that's where you just carried bombs over, and the Lancaster would hold 16 1000s. That's 8 tons. That's a pretty good load. When we were on main force, we did 13 trips to France just before D-Day. And the places we went to, like Tours, Reims, Dijon, I can't understand why Hitler didn't know exactly where they were going to land on D-Day, because we were ringed right around there to stop all the transportation and supply routes and whatever. And the British had I thought, an ingenious idea. When we went to those trips before D-Day, there'd be like 1,000 lengths on this target and 1,000 on that target, and so on. And with 16 1,000 pounders on, they would have a different fuse timer. The timing of the fuse, like for example, there might be one bomb, as an example, it would in the 16 that just would explode on contact when it hit the ground. We were going after railroad yards. And then there might be one that's fused to go off in 2 hours. There might be one that's fused to go off the next day, and so on. So you can imagine how long it would take them to get into that yard and start making repairs. Dirty work, I say. The CO that I had on the next squadron that I went to was for Pathfinders. And we were doing the marking. And I don't know how I got posted there, I was told that you'd better do your job or you'll get posted back to where you came from. So maybe getting there wasn't that difficult, but staying there was difficult. But when I first got there to Pathfinders, they took my bomb aimer and put him on a course to make a navigator out of him. And the Pathfinder crews ended up with 2 navigators. One that got the fixes, you know, he was using the radar, and on the screen he'd pick up where they were. The problem with that was that the Jerrys figured out how the radar worked, and their night fighters were homing on that. So you only could have the radar on for a short while, and then you'd have to turn it off so that the night fighters couldn't home on you. But when I got to Pathfinders, as I said, they took my bomb aimer and they gave me what they call a Nav-2, the other navigator, that had already been on ops. And his crew had finished, or something happened to him, but I got him. And he was quite a guy. And the first time I saw him, he had this string around his neck, and he had his tools, like his triangle and his compass, and all on this string. And his name was Dyson. And I said, Dyson, what's this string around your neck? He says, have you ever crawled around on the floor looking for one of your tools? So anyway, and Dyson was quite a guy. I mean, if the radar wasn't working just right, he'd go back in the tail end and kick the boxes to try to get a better contact. And most of the time that worked. Anyway, he was also a Canadian. He was from British Columbia. And I went out and visited him once after the war. Anyway, the commanding officer that I had in 156 Squadron, which was the Pathfinder Squadron, was a guy named Bingham Hall. He had a double-barrel name. And we went on leave. We used to get leave every 6 weeks or something like that, if they could spare us. Anyway, we came back from leave and somebody says, Bingham Hall wants to talk to you. So I go up to his office, and of course he always had his office door wide open, and he'd see you coming down the hall, and he'd yell out, get in here, Mason. And so I got in there, and he says, the MPs, the military police, picked up your wireless operator last week, and when they looked in his gas mask case, which you were wearing, you know, he said his dancing shoes were in there. And Bingham Hall said, what are you going to do about that? Because he held the pilot responsible for his crew. Whatever happened, it was up to you. He says, what are you going to do about that, Mason? I said, well, I'm going to buy him a beer for sure. I bought a car when I got over there for 20 pounds. And it was a 1934 Austin, 10-horse Austin. The top speed was 45 miles an hour, but you didn't need any more speed on those roads. And so whenever we went on leave, or even if we stood down because of weather or whatever, we'd all pile in my little car and go somewhere. And I got to know a local family in the town almost next to the field we flew from, and he speculated on farm products. He would buy up a whole crop, and then when it matured, he would have paid for it already, and then he would load it. He had 14 lorries, big trucks, and he could haul it into London and to the market. And that was his business, and consequently, because it was an essential industry, he got a special petrol allowance. So when I would drive over there in my car, he'd fill it up. The only problem was that petrol had a dye in it, and the police could stop you with a test tube and reach down in there and see what color it was, and they'd know whether you had it illegal. When you're in uniform over there, in those days, if the police stopped you, which happened a lot of times, if they saw you in uniform, they'd just wave you on instead of sampling your tank. The guy that became the commanding officer of the Pathfinder group we were in Group 8. The guy that they put in charge of that was a guy named Bennett, and he had been a navigator. He was Australian. He'd been a navigator for the Royal Australian air travel, you know, and he was well known for his knowledge of navigation and so on. When he moved into the Pathfinders, he really clamped down on the skills of the navigators, and that was the secret of the Pathfinders, because your timing had to be perfect, which meant you had to fly. You flew a course, and if you didn't have any trouble, you'd stay on that course. If you got into trouble, you'd deviate from the course and work your way back, and that meant you had to have a good navigator. Quality or the standards were high for navigation. Bennett, who they put in charge of the Pathfinders, being as he was a pilot, he could get a plane and fly to any. He'd show up at any briefing, and he was known for taking off when the main force took off, and he'd end up over the target. He'd have a mosquito where he could get up around 35,000 feet, and he'd circle around over the target, assessing all the marking and everything. So you were constantly under surveillance, and Bennett was the guy. And when they established the Pathfinders, the accuracy at the target, take this relatively, was around 5%, which isn't very much. But after Bennett took over and standardized everything, and it went all the way up to, they mentioned something close to 50%. So it was worthwhile. We did all kinds of different marking. They had a system where the first units in were called the illuminators, and they would drop thousands of candle power lights on parachutes that would light up the target, and if it was clear enough, then it would come in the visual markers. They could pick up the marking the target and with different colored flares, and that's what the main force would bomb on. And every target under Bennett, they had a master bomber, and he would circle around over the target and assess the marking, and then he would call up by code to the main force that was coming in to bomb, and he would be giving them instructions on you overshoot the marking, you undershoot it, you port, starboard, and that's one of the reasons that it was so got to be so accurate. We were on powdered eggs, but the squadron used to buy real eggs from the local farmers, and they would issue us one real egg a week, and they had a rack in the kitchen with our name on it, and that egg would go in that rack, and then however you wanted it cooked or whatever the cook would do it. Actually, it was a good deal. And then one of the favorite expressions was, you're on this night, you're talking to your buddy, and he's not on, so you say to him, if I don't come back, you can have my egg. I told my crew early in our ops, we'll never say this is our last trip. We'll go on a trip, and if one of the crew members decides after we get back that it's our last trip, it's our last trip. Because I figured it was bad luck to do it any other way. The equipment that we got, when I first went on ops, we had what they called G-box. And that was two radio beams from the ground up, and where it intersected, you could use that to establish your fix, establish where you were. The problem was that soon after, this was part of the war, soon after we got the G-boxes, the Jerrys figured out a way to bend those beams. So they weren't very accurate. So we had to find something else. And when it first started, we'd use it to get across the channel. And once we got into the continent, we'd shut that off and go by direct calculations. What came right after the G-box was what they call H2S, which was a radar system. It would send out a beam that would hit the land, and it would come back and show on a screen how that beam had been changed by either a river or a coastline, or in some cases, certain cities, the way the population is displayed. You could tell, we had examples of what it should look like, and you could use that as a fix. You could say that's Stuttgart or Berlin for sure. So that became the basis of our navigation. But Jerry figured that out, and his night fighters started homing on that beam. So we could only use the H2S for certain places, certain time, and then shut it off so they couldn't home on you. And then the Germans came out with a night fighter that had two 20-millimeter cannons mounted in it, firing upward. And they would come in under the stream and shoot you down that way. So our boffins, or engineers as we call them, they devised a little, very small radar set that would send out a beam that would pick up these fighters underneath you. And you could open fire on them, or you could take evasive action to get away from them. But the radio operator, he worked that little radar system to pick up those night fighters. The guy that took over Bomber Command was a guy named Harris, and he was a tough nut. And when he first got in the job, he saw all this, the commands coming from command center, and information feeding back, and all this stuff. And some of the desk jockeys had opinions, and Harris didn't agree with them, so he shot out a message right away when he first took over the job, and he says, "When are you going to let me know when my my pilots would blow their nose. Some of the trips that we took, I took 53, I had 53 trips. Some of them were long, nine and a half. We went to a place twice up just off the Polish border, a town called Stettin. It was a U-boat repair depot, and Jerry was coming out with a very improved U-boat, and the idea, they weren't up to nuclear yet, but and the Germans were working on nuclear power. They actually had a heavy water plant in Norway, and the RAF bombed that one night. I'll throw the meeting open to questions anybody wants to ask. Or better, we were colonials, and the British had a lot of feelings towards the colonials, and Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, they got first class. Oh, oh boy, that's a tough one. You know, we were just doing a job, and the intelligence used to usually tell us when we were being briefed for a particular target, what we were going after. And Dresden, unfortunately, the intelligence officer said, put in your logbook the target's arms and legs. What he meant was that they were going to get as many civilians as they could, and the Germans estimated, I read it in the British paper, that the Germans said 220,000 civilians killed. And that was it got a lot of bad publicity. And well, even the Canadian BBC made a video depicting that particular raid and criticizing the decision that was made. Now, when it was, I was told this, when it was first put on the schedule, we were told that Churchill was in favor of that. But when it got so much publicity, he was a good politician. I don't know anything about it. But the Dresden Raid was, in a way, tragic. But they did come out with that there were some plants in Dresden making electronics. And it was a big railroad center. And the Russians, or the German army, was using Dresden as a R&R. And so from the Russian front, so some way or another, it got excused. Make up your own mind. But it was pretty tragic. Normally when you were going into bombing command, it was sort of standard practice that most of the crews were, when I was doing it, I mean, it got changed, but they were talking about 25 trips. And then you could go on leave and maybe get a job in training, or, you know, as an instructor, or that kind of thing. I don't know what made us keep going, but it was finally on the...
When you stopped, or
no.
53rd, or?
We came back. We went to Hamburg on our 53rd trip, and we came back, and it was in March of 45, or did I say that right? Yeah. And my mid-upper, Gordy, he got out and he says, "Skipper, I quit." So we all quit. But by this time, 53 trips
That's enough.
was enough, yeah. And I couldn't wait to get a passage on a boat back to Canada. And I'd been awarded the DFC, which was supposed to be presented by King George VI. And I had a date set for him. And I just wasn't going to wait for that. I got a chance to get on the Ile-de-France, and I came back on a boat in March of 45, yeah. So the war didn't end till May the 9th. So, and I was on the boat crossing over from England to Canada, and I was hoping the war ended while I was on the boat. I was hoping that the U-boats got the message. Well, eventually all of them. Yeah, but you know, when I first got into Pathfinders, there were only a few squadrons that even had Lancasters. And they've had, you know, there were either Halifaxes or Wellingtons, and they gradually got all the squadrons to get equipped with Lancasters, and shortly after that's when we got the the main thing that bothered them the most was the temperature. But you take like my rear gunner. I haven't answered your question yet, but I will. The rear gunner, they had a perspex, which was a plastic shield in front of them, and the guns went in between. Well, my gunner didn't think he could see that well through that perspex, so he took that whole panel out, and he had an electric heated suit, gloves, socks, the whole thing, and he was pretty comfortable, but it was a lonely job, sitting back there all by himself. Yeah, everybody did. Yeah, I got a picture of me with that. The idea was if you got shot down, that maybe somebody, if you were in a dinghy, somebody would hear you if you blew that whistle. I doubt it, but anyway, that was the idea. Well, to answer your first question, I didn't even think about flying until the war started, and then I could see where you had a chance to learn, even though I wasn't that much interested in the war. My mother was English, and of course she had one feeling, and I used to say, and my brother too, we don't get in that war. What do we care about what happens over there? And my mother would hit the ceiling then. But somehow we all survived. I thought of one thing, if I can digress for a minute. Coming back one night, the field that I was trying to get in was socked in. I mean, it was fog. And so I was diverted to another field further in England that was a U.S. Air Force base. They were flying V-24s. Well, there was a lot of things. They had a better bar than we did. And we had a flying boot that came up just below your knee. And it had a little pocket inside, and it was a suede leather on the outside, but the boot part was like a regular hard leather boot. But the top part was this soft suede-like leather with a sheepskin lining. Well, the idea was, if you got shot down, you could take that knife out and cut the threads for the upper part of that boot, and you'd have a walking boot. It was a pretty nice idea. Anyway, the U.S. guys at this field where I landed were fascinated by those boots. And they were making me all kinds of offers. They wanted to trade for my boots. And finally, I weakened, and we made a trade. I got one of their heavy leather sheepskin lined jackets, and they got my boots.
Did you get another pair when you got back?
Oh yeah, I just had to go to stores and, and sign my name. And fortunately, I didn't get many questions about what happened to your boots. Fortunately, I never got my license. When I first got back, I thought, I got all these hours. Maybe maybe Air Canada could use me. So I sent in an application, and then I called about it because I didn't hear anything. And this was a personnel guy I was talking to, and I said, you know, what's happened here? And he said, we train our own pilots. And I said, well, why? He says, most of the customers on an airliner don't like steep turns. I graduated from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and in those days, and I'm talking about 1946, yeah, there were all kinds of jobs. I mean, I had, they'd come to either to the university or they'd send for you to come at their expense and all these kind of things. So in Canada, I had like 4 offers. In the States, I had 2 offers. And the best one was in Toledo with the oil refinery. So I went to work for Pure Oil. Do you remember Pure Oil? It was called 76, and I don't know if it's in business anymore. But this is a long story. I got this job at Pure Oil, and we were doing corrosion studies, because in those days the crudes were pretty sour. They had high sulfur, and they were very corrosive. So there was a lot of equipment that gets replaced. And the job I had was set up studies. I put welded in buttons of stainless steel inside different equipment like towers, and then however it was losing metal, I could compare that to what was actually happening to the equipment. So we would then recommend replacement, and that was the first job I had. And then and I got interested in welding. And so I went to night school and took some welding courses. And then the supervisor I had, I'd been there a year and something, and I decided, well, I need a raise. So I went to this guy that was my boss. His name was William Frederick Kramer, spelled with a K. You can guess where he came from. Anyway, he said, I've worked for Pure Oil for 30 years or 25 years or something. He said, I never asked for a raise. He says, they want to give me a raise, they'll give me a raise. And I said, well, Bill, I don't think like you do. So the next Saturday, we used to take turns working weekends. And the next weekend I was on, the manager was on that same, so I went to him and I said, I think I'm entitled to a raise. He says, have you talked to Kramer? I said, yeah, I talked to Kramer, but he and I don't see alike. Oh, he says, I'll take care of it. Well, that was a signal to me to look for another job. And so I sent my resume out all over the place, and we weren't allowed, like our cafeteria, for example, was outside the gate. You know, in an oil refinery, the only thing that's inside the gate is the equipment. And I was coming out of lunch, and the manager of the refinery was right behind me, and he says, and it was raining, he says, I'll give you a ride back into the refinery. So we're riding along, and he said, incidentally, he said, your raise came through today. And, oh, nice. So I go down, that night I went home, and here's a telegram from a company up in Dunkirk, New York. They're part of the old American Locomotive Company. And they wanted to hire me because of the welding experience. And but I said to my wife, I said, I just got a $50 raise. I don't think I want to go anywhere. And so I called the guy that sent the wire and talked to him, and he said, oh, why don't you come up, take a day off and come up here, and says, we'll pay your expenses and I'll show you all around. And so I did. I went, and at that time I was making, just for an example, $450 a month. And the guy that took me all around, a fellow named Bennett, and then at the end of the day he took me into the plant manager's office, and his name was Murphy, big Irishman. He said, well, what do you think? I said, oh, I enjoyed it. He says, well, we'll pay you $550. I went $100 over in one day, just like that. But your question about NASA, I got into, we were making, at the plant, we were making equipment for the nuclear systems on Rickover's Navy, which meant you had to have secret clearance and so on. Well, and I had to get naturalized right away. I was an illegal entry. And so, and the Navy was doing the security for that plant. Well, I'll tell you, when the Navy wants to get something, they get it. I took one trip into Buffalo, and the next thing I knew, I was naturalized. There's a young fella that has a secret clearance. He has nuclear experience, and at that time, in the NASA facility here, was the NERVA program, which was nuclear. It was for design and testing of power units for propulsion, you know, for big trips like to Mars. And so that's where I ended up. It was the best place in the world. It just.
You got a raise.
And I got a. Oh yeah, and I got a raise. I liked going to work at NASA, and that's wonderful. There was, but the worst target that we ever had in our schedule was Nurenberg. And just to give you an example, there were 965 bombers on that trip. That's a lot. And they lost 96. That was the biggest loss. And that's like 10%, right? Most targets, if I can remember right, the average loss was somewhere around 4%. And depended on situation, a lot of things like weather. Weather was never kind to you. We flew in a stream, so we easily, you know, if we weren't alert, we could easily run into another plane, or could have a bomb dropped onto you, like, you know, put a hole right through the wing or something. Air collisions, see, the thing was, you had either a bomb aimer or another navigator who, when he wasn't busy with the course, he was the pair of eyes looking out the front. And he had two guns out there. He had a turret with 2 guns in it. I was sitting in like a This is like a thing you'd grow flowers in. If you look here, this is like a big glass area. So my head was going around in circles all the time, looking. Sitting next to me was the engineer. His job was a lookout. You had a mid-upper gunner, which was here, and you had a rear gunner here. We didn't have a underneath gunner like the U.S. had. Wish we had. It was a good idea. But anyway, you had a lot of eyes, and particularly the gunners were the ones. They trained for hours every day on night vision. And you know, you probably know this, to see something at night, you see it out the side. You don't see it, look at it directly. So that, you know, train yourself to be really looking out of the side of your eye, if you can believe that. This is my logbook here, if anybody wants to come look at it. I don't know. There's a few pictures in there. And this is a bit of a trick. In this, those are my wings, came off my uniform. That's the Pathfinder badge. And when you went to Pathfinders, you weren't a permanent Pathfinder until you'd done 7 trips. And then you gradually got to where you were awarded the Pathfinder badge as permanent. You're supposed to wear it on your uniform. This is the Canadian operational wing and bar there, because I did more than one tour. Those are my dog tags. That's the DFC. And I had 2 bronze stars here. And that's the Pathfinder Squadron. That's their logo. It says, "We light the way." We got told when we went to Reims, because of the Reims Cathedral, and when we went to Cologne, because of the cathedral there, we were told, absolutely do not drop unless you're absolutely sure. And I saw a postcard once after the war that showed Cologne right after it got bombed heavily, and they're sitting, everything's flat, and there's just a cathedral sitting there. So it worked, I'd say. What was your other question?
How long was your
Oh,
flight?
trips? Like from England to the Ruhr, let's say, which was a popular place. You know, there's a lot of manufacturing. That was the Krupp's work, I mean. That was about a little over 4 hours round trip. Berlin, it was a target you try to avoid, but that was about somewhere around 7 hours round trip. As I mentioned, Stettin, way up on the Polish border, that was almost 10 hours round trip. Your butt got pretty tired.
But you had enough gasoline? For
Oh yeah, the Lanc could 2,300 gallons. We averaged 200 gallons an hour on the trips. That was the engineer's job. Well, you can do the math.
close to 12 hours.
Yeah, we didn't have any that long. We had extra just in case. You know, you might get a hole in a tank in the wing, and you've lost 2 hours. It was a beautiful engine, except that it was very vulnerable to flak because it was liquid cooled. And you get a piece of flak in there and it would catch on fire. And we had 4 big buttons, like right there. And when you had a fire, you just hit that button and the whole cowling of that engine would fill with carbon dioxide. Smother it right out, but you couldn't start it again. Oh, the Lancaster by far. The Halifax was a very sturdy, it was built like a tank, but not very responsive. I was flying Halifax one night, coming back from Saarbrücken, and I was coming. That lady that from Hull, she here? Well, the other time I was here, there was a lady sitting right there, and anyway, I said we were approaching Hull, and there was a German raid on. The German fighters were over, bombers were dropping on Hull, and we were going right towards it with the anti-aircraft and flak coming up and everything. I said to my navigator, "We got to train. We got to change course." And he said, 10 seconds. And we did. We turned, but by this time, the Jerrys came out right underneath us, and they were being projected, and we got all their stuff. And in the Halifax, there was what they call a very pistol, which fired off the colors of the day. And I'm reaching up there trying to fire this thing to stop all this defenses. And my wireless operator, who his seat was right below my feet, he came up and took the safety catch off, fired it. And that stopped it.
One more question?
The first part, the ME-210 was an excellent aircraft. That's the one they mounted those upward firing cannon in. That was probably, well, the German P-109, which was almost equivalent to the Spitfire, looked like it. That was a good aircraft too. But bomber-wise, it's pretty hard to beat the Lancaster. Handling, durability, just a great machine. And it would take an awful beating. Aerodynamic-wise, you know what I mean? It didn't take much to shoot a Lancaster down with a flak. The problem with the Lancaster was that if you crashed somewhere and you were going to crash there, it was hard to get out of. Like the Halifax had a lot of room and you could get out easily, and we used to practice. The P-51 was probably the best fighter, really the overall best fighter. That was the U.S. And that's what I wanted to fly when I went to England. But they changed my mind. Yeah, I heard that the Germans did have something that was close to that. It was the Japs that were really good at that.
Well, I know the Japs did, but
I don't know how to answer you,
did you ever hear of it by chance? Or?
No. I did see an ME-262 once, so the Germans came out with the first jet, and we were on towards the, in 45, off and on, the RAF started doing daylights. And we were on a daylight to the Erft Dam. We were supposed to fly in low over the river upstream, and then we had torpedoes on, and we let them go downstream, hopefully that they would breach the dam. I don't know how successful it was, but when we were going there in the daylight, we were at 12,000 feet. The reason I quote this so well, because I saw a letter in one of the RAF publications where this guy was talking about seeing 262s, and I thought, well, I'll write to him and tell him what I saw. And there was a Lanc down, we were at 12,000 feet and he was at 10,000 feet. Now, I don't know what he was doing down there, but he was all by himself. And my engineer was sitting here and he says, "Look." And I looked and here's two little black dots. Unbelievable, just going right across the top of the clouds. And they jumped on this plank that was right below us and shot. He went through the clouds on fire, but I counted 5 shoots coming out of him. And then, well, I don't go any further than that, but that was when I saw an ME-262, and I was impressed. Good to see you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
very, very much. And a teeny tiny
Oh my
little
goodness.
memento from the Medina Library.
Well, the beer's going to taste better.
It will, won't it? Yeah, yeah.
I flew 30 B-17s.
Oh, good for you.
The 390 bombs Crown. We
Uh-huh.
were just north of Ipswich.
Yeah.
And I got there about the first week of December '44 and
Did you like
finished
my
up with
boots?
30.
Did you like my boots?
Never saw them really, I have to admit to that.
Yeah.
But anyway, God bless you.
Yeah.
We
And-
we know we were lucky.
Yeah, right. Damn lucky.
Damn lucky.
Damn lucky. Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
One quick question. What kind of bomb size did you guys use? You didn't use the Norton, did you?
No. It was similar though. It was a British design, and you entered in the course and the altitude and the wind, and it gave you.
But once the bombardier put that Norton sight on, he had control of the plane, not the pilot.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Our bombardier would he would open the bomb doors and he'd say, hold it steady, and he'd try to lead us into the target, and it was like